This is NDTV, and you're watching NDTV Profit.
Welcome back to Power Lunch. Banking reforms is in focus. The SARFAESI Act was passed yesterday, but the Banking Amendment Bill is still in the balance because we've got a new uncertainty that's been thrown in there as to whether banks should be allowed into the futures market, commodities futures in particular. Ashvin Parekh is partner and national leader of financial services at Ernst&Young. He's joining me here in the studio on both those issues. Thanks so much, Mr. Parekh, for coming in. Just a quick word on SARFAESI, which is the non-controversial part. Yeah. I mean, it's good that we've seen this go through. It does do a little bit in terms of strengthening recovery processes.
Yeah. Well, there are two parts to it, and in fact they certainly will strengthen the recovery process. One is the conversion of debt into equity, and that's an interesting because it throws in, additional methods under which reconstruction can be done. For instance, if the banks have larger equity, for example, then they will have larger control on the management through board, presentation or representation, and also making sure that critical resolutions, which are essential in the borrower company, to really reconstruct the asset, become easier to that extent, basically. So that's an important change to my mind. The second is the interesting provision 17 or section 17, which was originally examined by the Supreme Court. This was on the acquisition of assets.
Immovable properties.
The immovable properties, let's say, belonging to the borrower. And there, once again, what is important is that the rights are now being given to the banks. So perhaps, since the entire SARFAESI and the constituents of SARFAESI, that is the asset reconstruction companies, are under RBI regulations, basically, the RBI is the regulator for that. RBI will now soon come out with the regulations which will balance out, any grievance that the customers were. So earlier, if there was a judiciary system which stepped in, on behalf of the borrower, to examine whether the banks were or the lenders were going out of their way to harass or to do anything with the borrower, that part can easily be now managed by the regulator on one side. I'm talking about the negative aspect about it. But it does give banks, the lenders a much larger right, to recover and to reconstruct the assets. Basically.
Especially at a time like this, certainly helps the environment. So the more controversial part is what happened to the Banking Amendment Bill. We thought this one was going to go through now. And now there's this futures trading element which has been thrown in.
Yeah, to begin with, right from the time the whole thing was drafted, bulk of the provisions which were essential for the amendment were already carried in this. Now these one or two additional provisions which have been added at the last moment, Now what is happening in the process is that the Parliament gets an opportunity of once again sending the whole thing back to the Standing Committee.
Yeah.
Now once again that becomes a time-drawn process, because then the Standing Committee will once again meet and examine, the three provisions, and then offer its views, and recommendations to the Parliament. I thought, that in the larger interest of the system, if the government is really eager to bring about the reform and also to bring about new banks and new licenses, then in that case, the best thing that can be done is to just keep back these three provisions, which have suddenly been added after all that, But that's only a view, It's one of the ways in which at least the amendment can be carried out a little faster, I suppose.
But what is slightly baffling is why it's so important to bring in this futures thing right now. This was a debate, sir, we used to have many years ago. After that, it went out of the public sort of realm. Yeah. We haven't heard the RBI's views on it. Why is it important right now?
Yeah, see, the normal course. Yeah. All you really need to do, in the normal course, any instrument which is a part of the banking system or where the banks need to even participate in those instruments, in the normal course, the regulator does have the necessary powers to frame regulations. So it's adequate, there's no need really, to my mind, to go, and really try and create an environment, let's say particularly at this juncture, when the rest of the provisions are more critical, where the rest of the amendment is more critical, to now add this particular one, you can really tackle this requirement, you can meet with this requirement through adequate regulations, let the regulator come out with, what could be on hand is, on one side the banking system needs some kind of an hedging instrument, and that will be available through the commodities futures. However, if there are issues or systemic risk associated with that. You know, in the sense if there is too much of an exposure. In addition to, let's say, loans on the agriculture sector and all, then the regulator can come out with the normal course. He has several mechanisms and methods available to him, including risk weightages, you know, to those particular exposures, that he can really look at that. I mean, there's no need for the parliament really, and for the government really, to stop the entire reform on account of this particular one, I thought.
Absolutely. So the other provision that's being talked about, and I must say we don't have clarification, is this entire CCI purview over, you know, select bank. I mean, that's actually a relevant question in the context of the amendment.
That's a relevant one. That's a very relevant one. And to my mind, you know, the regulator should be allowed, quite clearly. You know, I mean, in the past, for instance, you know, between the Companies Act provisions, which require two companies merging, you know, to approach the courts and conduct the entire process under the supervision of the courts. Now, in case of banking companies, however, you know, Banking Regulation Act does give the regulator more powers in regards to M&A, and the courts will normally seek, you know, I mean, the first thing that the courts would look at is whether the regulator has cleared or approved of the scheme. Something like that can continue even in regards, you know, the Competition Commission, to the extent that the regulator, if he examines a scheme, and if it is in the public interest, I mean, that's the most critical point that the regulator is going to examine. Deposit holders' interest is the supermost in the minds of the regulator. So if he's examined that, you know, and something is really good from the public interest point of view, then I suppose, you know, the need to once again go through the competition, let's say, commission, may perhaps be examined. I mean, there is no need for that to my mind. There's one more aspect to it. See, if you look at the market share of the banking companies today, I can tell you, with merger of no two banks, are you really going to have, you know, a larger
monopoly situation, like
sort of anything, unless, I mean, you have 5 banks.
ICICI, HDFC Bank and Axis Bank merging.
But that's a remote possibility. It may just never sort of, you know, happen, in which case, you know, the whole issue of referring it to Competition Commission, particularly when it's if you look at the universe, it comprises of so many banking companies that the need for that perhaps may have to be really examined. So there is a very good justification, you know, on one side, and based in the public interest. I mean, it's very critical that the regulator examines it. You know, very clearly.
Sir, I hope this goes through. 4 years now since we've been discussing this?
Yeah, 4 years, 5 years, and I mean, you know, the whole reform is waiting for, you know, on account of this.
Thanks so much, Mr. Parekh, again for coming in. We are waiting for the government to get this through, but that's all the time we have on Power Lunch. Thanks so much for watching.